Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the German cruiser Blücher. Picture, if you will, a time when ships were not merely machines of steel and iron, but symbols of national pride, engineering excellence, and human ambition. In the story we explore tonight, we will journey through the life of a remarkable vessel, from her conception in the minds of naval architects to her final moments in the cold waters of a Norwegian fjord. This is a tale of craftsmanship, duty, and the inexorable currents of history that sweep all things before them. Our story takes place in an era when the world was transforming, when nations competed not just in commerce and diplomacy, but in the mastery of the seas. It is a human story, filled with the dreams of designers, the labor of shipbuilders, the discipline of sailors, and the tragedy of war. Tonight we will slow down, take our time, and immerse ourselves in every detail of this journey. So settle in, find a comfortable position, and let us begin at the beginning. To understand the Blücher, we must first understand the world that created her. The story begins not with steel and rivets, but with ink and paper in the aftermath of the First World War. When the Great War ended in November 1918, Germany found itself defeated, exhausted, and humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919, imposed strict limitations on German military power. The once mighty Imperial German Navy, the Kaiserliche Marine, which had challenged British naval supremacy, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The treaty permitted Germany to maintain only a small defensive navy. Capital ships were limited to 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats. No submarines were allowed. No ship could displace more than 10,000 tons, and no guns larger than 280 millimeters could be mounted. These restrictions shaped German naval thinking for the next 2 decades. The officers and designers of the new Reichsmarine, and later the Kriegsmarine, became masters of working within constraints, of maximizing capability within strict limits, of bending rules without quite breaking them. During the 1920s, Germany built several ships within these restrictions. The light cruisers Emden, Königsberg, Karlsruhe, and Köln emerged from German shipyards, modern vessels designed to fulfill the limited roles permitted by the treaty. These were cautious years, years of rebuilding, years of waiting. But beneath the surface, German naval ambitions never truly disappeared. Officers studied, planned, and prepared. They knew that treaties could be renegotiated, that circumstances could change, that Germany might one day reclaim its place among the naval powers. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Germany began to test the boundaries of the Treaty of Versailles with the construction of the Deutschland-class ships, which the world came to know as pocket battleships. These vessels, Deutschland, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Graf Spee, were officially designated as armored cruisers with a displacement just at the treaty limit of 10,000 tons, though in reality they exceeded this. They were remarkable ships, featuring diesel propulsion for enormous range, heavy armor, and a main armament of 6 280mm guns. They could outgun any cruiser and outrun any battleship. They represented German ingenuity applied to the problem of creating maximum naval power within minimum displacement. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, everything changed. Hitler had little initial interest in naval matters, being primarily focused on rebuilding the German army for land warfare. However, he recognized the Navy's value for prestige and intimidation. More importantly, he was willing to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1935, Hitler announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, in direct violation of Versailles. Days later, he proclaimed the introduction of military conscription and announced plans to expand the German military. The world protested but did little. Britain, hoping to contain German naval expansion through agreement rather than confrontation, entered into negotiations with Germany. The result was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, signed on June 18, 1935. This agreement was a watershed moment. It effectively nullified the naval provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was now permitted to build a navy up to 35% of the total tonnage of the Royal Navy. For submarines, Germany was allowed parity with Britain. The agreement was controversial. France, which had not been consulted, felt betrayed. The League of Nations was undermined. But for Germany, it represented international recognition and legitimacy. The Kriegsmarine could now plan openly for expansion. With the shackles removed, the Kriegsmarine's planning offices hummed with activity. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, who commanded the Navy, was a strategic thinker with definite ideas about naval warfare. He believed in a balanced fleet capable of challenging Britain's maritime supremacy. Not through direct confrontation, which would be suicidal, but through commerce raiding and the threat of a fleet in being. Raeder's vision required capital ships to threaten British sea lanes and tie down Royal Navy forces, but it also required cruisers. Cruisers were the workhorses of any navy, versatile vessels capable of reconnaissance, trade protection, escort duties, and surface combat. Germany's existing light cruisers were aging and insufficient for a navy with global ambitions. The Kriegsmarine planners turned their attention to developing a class of heavy cruisers. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which Germany had not signed but which established international norms, defined heavy cruisers as vessels with guns between 155 and 203 millimeters in caliber, with a maximum displacement of 10,000 tons. The German designers aimed for this standard. They envisioned a class of 5 heavy cruisers designated as the Admiral Hipper class after Admiral Franz von Hipper, who had commanded the German battlecruiser fleet at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. These ships would carry 8 203mm guns in 4 twin turrets, have heavy armor protection, and possess a high speed of around 32 knots. They would be magnificent vessels, the equal of any heavy cruiser afloat. The first ship of the class, the Admiral Hipper, was laid down on July 6, 1935, at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg. The second ship would be named Blücher, after Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the Prussian field marshal who had played a crucial role in the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The name Blücher had special resonance for the German Navy. The previous Blücher, an armored cruiser launched in 1908, had been the pride of the Imperial German Navy. She had fought at the Battle of Dogger Bank on January 24th, 1915, where she was sunk by British battlecruisers after a brave but hopeless fight. The crew of the old Blücher had fought their ship to the end, and when she capsized and sank, 792 men died in the freezing North Sea. The survivors, rescued by British ships, were treated with respect by their captors, who admired their courage. By naming the new heavy cruiser Blücher, the Kriegsmarine honored both the Prussian field marshal and the brave sailors of the First World War. It was a name heavy with tradition and expectation. On August 15, 1936, at the Deutsche Werke shipyard in Kiel, a ceremony took place that marked the official beginning of the Blücher's existence. The laying of a ship's keel is always a significant moment, the point at which a vessel transitions from concept to physical reality. Kiel was an appropriate birthplace. Located on the Baltic Sea at the eastern end of the Kiel Canal, which connects the Baltic to the North Sea, Kiel had been the home of the Imperial German Navy's Baltic Fleet. The city breathed naval tradition. Its shipyards had built some of Germany's finest warships. The Deutsche Werke, or German Works, was one of several shipyards in Kiel capable of building large warships. The yard had experience with cruiser construction, having built light cruisers in the 1920s and early 1930s. The keel-laying ceremony was attended by naval officers, shipyard officials, and workers. There were speeches about Germany's return to naval greatness, about the traditions being honored, about the ship that would rise from this foundation. Then, with the proper rituals observed, the first steel sections of the keel were lowered into place on the slipway. From that moment, Blücher began to grow. Building a heavy cruiser in the 1930s was an enormously complex undertaking. The Blücher would eventually displace over 14,000 tons when fully loaded, far more than the nominal 10,000-ton limit of the Washington Naval Treaty. She would be 202.8 meters long, with a beam of 21.3 meters and a draft of 7.2 meters. She would be a city of steel, home to over 1,600 men, equipped with everything necessary for extended operations at sea. The construction process followed a careful sequence. First, the keel and bottom hull were assembled on the slipway. These lower sections included the double bottom, a safety feature that provided protection against mines and torpedoes, and storage for fuel oil, which would be stored in tanks within the double bottom and along the sides of the ship. As the hull took shape, massive steel frames were erected, forming the skeleton of the ship. These frames supported the hull plating, which was riveted and welded into place. The plating varied in thickness depending on location. The armor belt, which protected the ship's vital spaces, consisted of 70 to 80 millimeters of steel. The deck armor was thinner, ranging from 12 to 30 millimeters, as the designers expected most threats to come from the side rather than from above. Inside the growing hull, compartments took shape. The Blücher was subdivided into hundreds of watertight compartments to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the ship. There were compartments for machinery, for ammunition, for stores, for fuel, for crew quarters, for galleys and mess halls, for medical facilities, for command and control centers. The engineering spaces were particularly complex. The Blücher was powered by 3 sets of geared steam turbines, each driving one propeller shaft. Steam was provided by 12 high-pressure boilers, divided into 4 boiler rooms. This machinery could generate 132,000 shaft horsepower, enough to propel the ship at speeds exceeding 32 knots. Installing this machinery required enormous precision. Each turbine weighed many tons and had to be carefully lowered into the ship through openings in the deck. The boilers, the condensers, the reduction gears, the miles of piping for steam, water, fuel, and hydraulics, all had to be fitted perfectly. Above the waterline, the superstructure rose in tiers. The Blücher followed the standard German heavy cruiser design, with a relatively low silhouette to reduce target area. The forward superstructure housed the bridge, from which the ship would be commanded at sea. This was a complex space with an open bridge for visibility in good weather and an enclosed conning tower for battle conditions, protected by 150 millimeters of armor. The ship's main armament consisted of 8 203mm SKC/34 guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, designated Anton and Bruno forward and Caesar and Dora aft. These were powerful weapons capable of firing a 122-kilogram shell to a range of 33,500 meters. Each turret was a fortress in itself, protected by armor up to 160 millimeters thick, containing complex machinery for elevating and training the guns, loading the ammunition, and managing the crew of over 30 men required to operate it. The secondary armament was equally impressive. 12 105mm SKC/33 guns and 6 twin mounts provided anti-aircraft and anti-surface capability. 12 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 8 20mm guns offered additional defense against aircraft. 3 triple torpedo tube mounts, each housing 3 533mm torpedoes, gave the Blücher a powerful close-range weapon. Then there were the sensors and communications equipment. The Blücher was fitted with advanced fire control systems, including rangefinders and directors for the main and secondary batteries. She carried radar, a relatively new technology in the late 1930s, though early German naval radar was less sophisticated than British systems. The ship also required an enormous amount of electrical wiring. Thousands of kilometers of cable threaded through the hull, connecting equipment, providing power and lighting, enabling communications. There were multiple electrical generators to provide power, with redundant systems to ensure that damage to one area would not cripple the entire ship. As the months passed, the Blücher grew. Workers swarmed over her, welding, riveting, painting, installing. The work was hard, often dangerous, and always demanding. Shipbuilding required skilled labor. Welders, electricians, pipe fitters, machinists, carpenters. It also required precise coordination among hundreds of workers and dozens of different trades. After more than a year of construction, the Blücher was ready for launching. A launch, distinct from commissioning, is the moment when a ship first enters the water. She would still require many more months of work before she could enter service, but the launch was a major milestone. The launch was scheduled for June 8, 1937. This was to be a grand occasion, a public celebration of German naval rebirth and engineering prowess. As the day approached, the shipyard prepared. The slipway was greased to allow the ship to slide smoothly into the water. Triggers were set up that would release the supports holding the ship at the proper moment. Safety precautions were implemented, as launches could be dangerous if something went wrong. The weather on June 8th was pleasant, a mild early summer day in Kiel. Flags and bunting decorated the shipyard. A crowd gathered, including naval officers in their dress uniforms, Nazi Party officials, shipyard workers and their families, and curious civilians. The launch ceremony followed German naval tradition. There were speeches praising the ship, praising German engineering, praising the workers who had built her. The Führer sent a message of congratulations. Nazi propaganda made much of such occasions, using them to demonstrate Germany's resurgent power. The sponsor of the ship, who would perform the traditional bottle breaking, was chosen for symbolic value. For the Blücher, the sponsor was a member of the Blücher family, a descendant of the famous field marshal, continuing the link between the ship and the family name. At the appointed moment after the speeches concluded, the sponsor approached the ship's bow. With a swing of her arm, she sent a bottle of champagne smashing against the steel hull, christening the ship. Ich taufe dich auf den Namen Blücher. I christen you with the name Blücher. The triggers were released. The Blücher, held by nothing now but gravity and inertia, began to move. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, she slid down the slipway. The rumble of her movement vibrated through the ground. Workers and spectators watched with held breath as thousands of tons of steel accelerated toward the water. With an enormous splash that sent spray flying high into the air, the Blücher entered the Baltic Sea for the first time. She plunged bow first into the water, then bobbed up, floating free, held by tugboats that had been standing by. A cheer went up from the crowd. The band played. Officers saluted. The Blücher was afloat. The launch was celebrated, but it marked the beginning of a new phase of work rather than the end. The Blücher was now afloat, but she was far from ready for service. She was a hull, with some machinery installed, but lacking most of the equipment, weapons, and systems that would make her a fighting ship. The Blücher was moved to a fitting-out berth where work would continue. The fitting-out process for a major warship typically took a year or more, sometimes longer if there were complications or if priorities shifted. During fitting out, the work that couldn't easily be done on the slipway was completed. The main armament turrets, which had been under construction at the Krupp works, were delivered and installed. These massive structures, each weighing hundreds of tons, were carefully lifted by floating cranes and lowered into their barbettes. The armored cylinders that supported them and housed the ammunition hoists and machinery below decks. Installing a turret was a feat of engineering. The tolerances had to be exact. The roller paths on which the turret rotated had to be perfectly machined and aligned. The complex system of hydraulics, electrical connections, and mechanical linkages that allowed the turret to train, rotate, and the guns to elevate had to be carefully fitted and tested. Once the turrets were installed, they had to be tested. First, the mechanical systems were tested without ammunition. The turrets rotated back and forth, the guns elevated and depressed, the loading machinery cycled. Engineers watched for any problems, any binding, any irregularities. Adjustments were made, parts were replaced, everything was fine-tuned. The same process was repeated for every system on the ship. The boilers were fired up for the first time, carefully monitored for any leaks or problems. The turbines were tested, slowly at first, then at increasing speeds. The electrical systems were energized and tested. The steering gear, the anchor windlasses, the boat davits, the ventilation systems, everything had to work perfectly. The ship's interior was completed, bulkheads were painted, decks were covered with linoleum or other materials, the crew spaces were furnished. The galley was equipped with stoves and other cooking equipment. The sick bay received its medical equipment. The offices and ready rooms throughout the ship were fitted out. Throughout this period, specialists from various equipment manufacturers came aboard to supervise the installation and testing of their systems. Representatives from the electrical contractors, from the boiler manufacturers, from the weapon systems companies all spent time aboard, ensuring their systems were properly installed and functional. As the Blücher neared completion, her first crew began to assemble. The Kriegsmarine had been expanding rapidly, and there was high demand for experienced officers and ratings. Many of the Blücher's crew were relatively young, as the service had been small for so long and was now growing quickly. The ship's first commanding officer was Kapitän zur See Heinrich Woldagh, a career naval officer with experience in cruisers. He came aboard in late 1938 to oversee the final stages of fitting out and to prepare for sea trials. Under his command was a wardroom of officers responsible for various departments: the executive officer, first watch officer, the gunnery officer, the torpedo officer, the engineering officer, the navigation officer, the communications officer, and others. Below the officers were the petty officers and enlisted men, organized into divisions based on their specialties. There were gunners, torpedomen, engine room ratings, electricians, damage control parties, signalmen, radio operators, cooks, medical personnel, and many others. A heavy cruiser was a complex organization requiring a diverse array of skills. The crew began the process of learning their ship. They familiarized themselves with the layout, learning the maze of passageways, ladders, and compartments. They learned evacuation routes, the locations of damage control equipment, the operation of the various systems. They practiced drills, abandoned ship drills, damage control drills, fire drills, man overboard drills. The gunnery crews trained with their weapons, at first with empty breeches and simulated ammunition, later with actual shells. They learned to work as teams: the loaders, the rammers, the trainers and elevators, the gun captains. They learned to do it in the light, in the dark, in calm conditions, and while the ship pitched and rolled. In early 1939, the Blücher was ready for sea trials. This was the moment when all the years of planning, all the months of construction would be tested. Would the ship perform as designed? Would all the systems work properly? Were there any serious problems that needed to be corrected? Sea trials are conducted in stages, starting with simple tests and gradually building to more demanding ones. The Blücher began with harbor trials, during which her systems were tested while she remained moored or made short trips in calm, protected waters. The engines were run at various speeds. The ship was maneuvered to test her handling characteristics, her turning radius, her ability to go from forward to reverse. All of this was done carefully with plenty of tugs standing by in case something went wrong. When the harbor trials were satisfactory, the Blücher ventured into the open Baltic for her sea trials proper. These trials would test every aspect of her performance. Speed trials were conducted to verify that the ship could reach her designed speed. The Blücher was driven at increasing speeds, her engines pushing harder and harder. She cut through the Baltic swells, her bow wave rising high, her wake streaming behind. The engineers monitored every gauge, every temperature, every pressure reading. The ship vibrated with the power of her machinery. The Blücher exceeded expectations, reaching speeds of over 32 knots, meeting her design specifications. The turbines ran smoothly. The hull design proved efficient, and the ship handled well even at high speed. Endurance trials tested the ship's range and fuel consumption. The Blücher cruised at various speeds for extended periods while her fuel consumption was carefully measured. These trials confirmed that she had a range of approximately 6,800 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 20 knots, though at high speed her range was much reduced. Gunnery trials tested the main and secondary armaments. The ship's guns were fired at targets, both floating targets and targets towed by aircraft. The fire control systems were evaluated. The gunners practiced ranging, tracking, and engaging targets while the ship was in motion. The 203mm main guns produced an enormous concussion when fired. The blast wave could injure anyone on deck who wasn't properly protected. When all 4 turrets fired together in a broadside, the ship trembled and the roar was deafening. The shells arced out across the sea, and seconds later geysers of water erupted near the targets. Or if the gunnery was good, the targets themselves were hit and shattered. The torpedo tubes were tested as well, with exercise torpedoes that were recovered after their runs for reuse. The anti-aircraft guns were tested, firing at targets towed by aircraft or at balloons. Damage control drills were conducted with simulated casualties. Compartments were deliberately flooded to test the watertight integrity and the crew's ability to control flooding. Firefighting equipment was tested. Medical drills practiced handling mass casualties. Throughout the trials, problems were identified and corrected. No ship emerges from sea trials without issues. Some equipment didn't work as expected and had to be adjusted or replaced. Some procedures had to be modified. The crew learned the quirks and characteristics of their ship. After successfully completing her trials, the Blücher was ready for formal commissioning into the Kriegsmarine. The commissioning ceremony took place on September 20th, 1939, at Kiel. The date is significant. Germany had invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, had declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The Second World War had begun. The timing of Blücher's commissioning, just 17 days into the war, meant that she entered service during wartime. Though the war was still in its early stages and the Baltic remained relatively quiet. The ceremony, normally a grand public occasion, was more subdued given the circumstances. The commissioning ceremony followed naval tradition. The ship's company was assembled on deck in formal ranks. The naval ensign was raised for the first time on an active warship. Kapitan zur See Voldag formally took command, reading his orders appointing him as the ship's commanding officer. The crew, already aboard for trials, was now formally part of the ship's complement. With the ceremony complete, the Blücher was now KMS Blücher, Kriegsmarine Blücher, a warship in active service. She was assigned to the Kriegsmarine's cruiser forces operating out of Kiel and later Wilhelmshaven. Her sister ship, Admiral Hipper, had been commissioned in April 1939. A third ship of the class, Prinz Eugen, was still under construction and would not be ready until 1940. 2 additional ships had been planned but were never completed. Even after commissioning, the Blücher was not immediately ready for combat operations. The ship and crew needed time to work up to operational readiness. This workup period involved intensive training in all aspects of naval warfare. The crew practiced gunnery repeatedly. They fired at targets in the Baltic, honing their skills at different ranges in different weather conditions with different fire control solutions. The goal was to make every action automatic, every response instinctive, so that in the chaos of combat the gun crews would perform flawlessly. They practiced damage control endlessly. Naval combat in the age of armor and steel was a brutal business. Ships were hit, compartments flooded, fires broke out, men were wounded and killed. The crew's ability to control damage often determined whether a ship survived or sank. The Blücher's damage control parties practiced shoring up damaged bulkheads, controlling flooding, fighting fires, evacuating casualties. Navigation training prepared the officers and crew for operating in restricted waters, for navigating by dead reckoning when visibility was poor, for avoiding hazards. The Baltic, while relatively calm compared to the North Atlantic, had its own challenges. Shallow waters, narrow passages, dense shipping traffic. The Blücher conducted exercises with other ships, practicing fleet maneuvers, learning to work as part of a formation. Destroyers escorted her during these exercises, practicing anti-submarine screening and coordination. She worked with aircraft, practicing the coordination of reconnaissance and spotting. All of this took place against the backdrop of war. In September and October 1939, Poland was crushed between Germany and the Soviet Union. In the West, the French and British armies faced the Germans across the fortified borders. But there was little fighting during this phony war period. At sea, German U-boats hunted Allied merchantmen and warships. For the Blücher, these first months were spent in the Baltic, away from the main naval war in the Atlantic and North Sea. The Baltic was important for training and for maintaining communications with German forces in East Prussia, but it was not a major theater of combat operations. To understand the Blücher's fate, we must understand the strategic situation Germany faced in late 1939 and early 1940. Grand Admiral Raeder and the Kriegsmarine leadership knew that Germany was not ready for a naval war with Britain. The massive naval expansion program, Plan Z, was supposed to create a balanced fleet by the mid-1940s. The war had come years too early. The Kriegsmarine was heavily outnumbered by the Royal Navy. Germany had no aircraft carriers, only 2 battleships operational, with several more under construction, and a limited number of cruisers and destroyers. The U-boat force, which would become the primary German naval weapon, was still relatively small in late 1939. Raiders' strategy, given this imbalance, was to avoid decisive battles and instead attack Britain's maritime commerce. German surface ships would raid Allied shipping lanes. U-boats would sink merchant ships. The goal was to strangle Britain's economy and force her to negotiate peace. However, Germany's geographic position made this strategy difficult. The North Sea exits were controlled by Britain. The English Channel was too narrow and well defended. The only route to the Atlantic for German surface ships was the northern route around Scotland, or through the gap between Iceland and Greenland. Both routes could be watched and patrolled by the Royal Navy. Operating from German ports in the North Sea, German ships were also vulnerable to British air attack and submarine attack. They lacked the forward bases that would make Atlantic operations easier. This strategic situation would lead directly to Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway, and that operation would be the Blücher's moment of destiny. Through the winter of 1939 to 1940, the Blücher continued her training and workup. The Baltic winter can be harsh with cold winds, rough seas, and sometimes ice. The crew grew accustomed to their ship in all conditions. There were periods in port where maintenance was performed, where crew members could briefly go ashore, where the ship took on supplies. There were periods at sea, exercising, training, patrolling. The mood in Germany during that winter was complex. The swift victory over Poland had been celebrated, but the war with Britain and France continued. The costs of war had not yet become apparent to most Germans. The great campaigns of 1940, the invasion of France, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, all lay in the future. For the crew of the Blücher, life settled into a rhythm. They were young men, most of them serving their country as generations before them had done. Some were career sailors, others were conscripts serving their required time. They came from all over Germany, from Bavaria and Prussia, from the Rhineland and Saxony, from cities and from farms. They formed friendships, these young men living in close quarters aboard a steel ship. They shared meals in the mess decks, told stories, wrote letters home, worried about sweethearts and families. They took pride in their ship, in keeping her clean and functional, in performing their duties well. The officers similarly formed a wardroom community. They dined together in the officers' mess, discussed tactics and strategy, studied their profession. The relationship between officers and crew in the German Navy, as in most navies, was hierarchical but not without respect. Good officers looked after their men, and good crews responded with loyalty and discipline. As winter gave way to early spring in 1940, new orders began to circulate. Something was being planned, something significant. Ships were being prepared, troops were being assembled. The Kriegsmarine was about to undertake one of its most ambitious operations of the war. In early 1940, both Germany and the Allies were considering operations in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway. The reasons were strategic and economic. For Germany, Norwegian neutrality was preferable to Norwegian alignment with the Allies, but Britain and France seemed to be considering violating Norwegian neutrality themselves. More importantly, Germany depended heavily on iron ore from Sweden, much of which was shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik during winter months when the Baltic was frozen. Controlling Norway would secure this vital supply line. Additionally, control of Norwegian ports and airfields would give Germany access to the North Atlantic, breaking the British blockade. German ships and U-boats could operate from Norwegian bases, threatening Allied convoys and extending Germany's reach. For Britain, Norwegian neutrality was also valuable, but there were compelling reasons to consider operations in Norway. Interdicting the iron ore traffic from Narvik to Germany would hurt the German war economy. Additionally, supporting Finland, which was fighting the Soviet Union in the Winter War, might be possible through Norway and Sweden, though this became moot when Finland made peace with the Soviets in March 1940. Hitler, influenced by Raeder and by concerns about British intentions, decided to act. On March 1, 1940, he issued the directive for Operation Weserübung, Exercise Weser, the code name for the invasion of Denmark and Norway. The operation would be extraordinarily ambitious. Germany would simultaneously invade two neutral countries, Denmark and Norway, using coordinated air, land, and sea forces. The distances involved were vast, the coordination required was complex, and the risks were substantial. If the Royal Navy intercepted the invasion forces at sea, the results could be catastrophic for Germany. The naval component of Weserübung was planned and coordinated by Admiral Rolf Karls, the Naval Group Commander North, working under Raeder's overall direction. The operation called for simultaneous landings at multiple Norwegian ports: Narvik in the far north, Trondheim in central Norway, Bergen on the west coast, Kristiansand in the south, and Oslo, the capital, in the Oslo Fjord. Denmark would also be occupied, giving Germany control of the Skagerrak and access to Norwegian waters. Each landing force would consist of warships carrying troops escorted by other warships. The troops would be landed directly into the harbors, seizing them by surprise before the Norwegians could react. This was risky. Warships are not designed to carry large numbers of troops, and if the surprise was lost, the ships would be vulnerable in restricted waters. For the Oslo operation, Warship Group 5 was organized. It would consist of the heavy cruiser Blücher, flagship carrying Rear Admiral Oskar Kummetz; the heavy cruiser Lützow, formerly Deutschland, renamed in late 1939; the light cruiser Emden; 3 torpedo boats, small destroyers, Albatros, Condor, and Mova; 8 auxiliary ships carrying additional troops and supplies. The force would carry approximately 2,000 troops, including elements of the 163rd Infantry Division and other specialized units. The military commander of the landing force was General Erwin Engelbrecht. The plan called for the force to approach Oslo during the night of April 8th to 9th, 1940, transiting the Oslo Fjord under cover of darkness. They would arrive at the city at dawn, surprise the defenses, and land troops directly at the Oslo piers. The troops would then rapidly secure the government buildings, airfields, and key installations. The capture of Oslo was considered essential. Oslo was not just Norway's capital, but its administrative, economic, and communication center. Capturing the city and the Norwegian government would, it was hoped, lead to rapid Norwegian capitulation. However, the plan had significant risks. The Oslo Fjord is long and narrow, stretching about 100 kilometers from its mouth to the city. The fjord is only a few kilometers wide at its narrowest points. The Norwegians had fortifications at several points along the fjord, including the narrow Drøbak Sound, where the fjord narrows to less than 500 meters. The German planners knew about these fortifications but believed they could be negotiated with surprise and speed. The assessment was that Norwegian defenses would be lightly manned, the garrisons would be on peacetime footing, and the sudden appearance of German warships would paralyze any resistance. This assessment would prove tragically wrong, at least for the Blücher. In early April 1940, the ships of Warship Group 5 gathered at Kiel and Swinemünde, taking on board their troops, equipment, and supplies. The troops came aboard with full combat gear, rifles, machine guns, ammunition, field equipment. They packed themselves into every available space on the ships, filling compartments normally used for other purposes. The Blücher, designed to carry a crew of about 1,600, now had over 1,000 additional soldiers aboard. The ship was crowded, uncomfortable, with men sleeping wherever they could find space. The soldiers, many of whom had never been to sea before, would have to endure a journey through potentially rough seas. Kapitän Zerzay Heinrich Voldag, the Blücher's commanding officer, received his orders. He would be embarking Rear Admiral Kumitz, who would command the entire warship group from the Blücher. This made the Blücher the flagship, with all the additional communications and command responsibilities that entailed. The ship's company made final preparations. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Damage control supplies were positioned and inventoried. The engineering department ensured that all machinery was in top condition. The medical staff prepared the sick bay for possible casualties. The crew knew they were going into action, though most didn't know the exact objective until later. There was nervous anticipation, excitement mixed with anxiety. This was what they had trained for, but training is never quite the same as reality. On the evening of April 7, 1940, Warship Group 5 departed from its anchorage and headed north toward the Skagerrak and the Oslo Fjord beyond. The operation was underway. As darkness fell on April 7th, the ships of Warship Group 5 formed up and proceeded north through the calm waters of the Baltic. The weather was overcast but mild, with light winds. Visibility was moderate, not perfect, but adequate for navigation. Aboard the Blücher, the atmosphere was tense but purposeful. The watch officers conned the ship from the bridge, maintaining formation with the other vessels. The soldiers, crammed into the ship's interior spaces, tried to rest as best they could. Many were seasick, not yet accustomed to the motion of a ship at sea. The ships maintained strict blackout discipline, showing no lights that might betray their presence to potential observers. Radio communications were kept to a minimum, with messages being passed by signal lamp or flag when possible. As the group proceeded north, they passed through German-controlled waters, so there was little fear of British interference at this stage. However, as they approached the Skagerrak and Norwegian waters, the risk would increase. The Skagerrak is the strait that connects the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, running between Denmark and Norway. It was a busy waterway even in wartime, with neutral Swedish shipping passing through. along with Danish and Norwegian vessels. During the night and the following day of April 8th, the German ships pressed on. The weather deteriorated somewhat with increasing wind and rougher seas, but nothing the warships couldn't handle comfortably. For the landlubber soldiers packed inside, however, the motion became more unpleasant. Unknown to the Germans as they approached, the Norwegians were becoming increasingly aware that something was happening. Reports of German ship movements had been received. The British had begun mining Norwegian waters on April 8th, further increasing tension. The Norwegian government, determined to maintain neutrality, had nonetheless begun a partial mobilization of its small military. Coastal fortifications were being alerted and brought to a higher state of readiness. However, the mobilization was incomplete, hampered by indecision, poor communications, and the hope that war might still be avoided. The fortifications guarding the Oslo fjord were under the command of Colonel Birger Eriksen. The main fortress was Oscarsborg, located on islands in the Drøbak Sound, the narrowest point of the fjord about 30 kilometers south of Oslo. Oscarsborg Fortress was old, dating to the mid-19th century. Its main armament consisted of 3 280mm Krupp guns manufactured in Germany in 1893 and installed in the fortress in the 1890s. There were also secondary batteries of 150mm and 57mm guns, searchlight positions, and torpedo batteries installed on the shores near the fortress. These were not modern weapons. The 280mm guns were manually operated, using technology that was nearly 50 years old. However, they were well maintained and in the narrow confines of the Drøbak Sound. Range was not an issue. Any ship passing through would be less than a kilometer from the guns. Colonel Eriksen, a career officer, was determined to do his duty. When reports reached him of approaching ships, he ordered his fortress to full readiness. Ammunition was brought up, guns were manned, searchlights were prepared. Critically, he also ordered the torpedo battery readied. This battery, located at Kopos Point, had 2 torpedo tubes containing elderly Whitehead torpedoes of Austrian manufacture dating from about 1900. As night fell on April 8th, Warship Group 5 approached the mouth of the Oslo fjord. The plan called for them to enter the fjord under cover of darkness and transit its length during the night, arriving at Oslo at dawn. The ships reduced speed as they entered the fjord. Navigation in restricted waters at night is always challenging, requiring careful attention to charts, landmarks, and soundings. The fjord sides were dark masses against the sky, with only occasional lights from houses or small villages. The first obstacle was the outer fortifications, which the ships passed without incident. The garrisons were not fully alert, and the German ships slipped by in the darkness. As the force proceeded up the fjord, the tension increased. They were now committed. There was no turning back without exposing themselves to potential Norwegian response. Speed and surprise were everything. The ships passed through the Drøbak Sound approach, heading for the Narrows. This was the critical point. If the Norwegians were going to respond, it would be here. At Oscarsborg, the watch reported the sound of ships approaching. Colonel Eriksen, awakened in the early morning hours, came to the fortress's command post. The time was about 4 o'clock in the morning on April 9th, 1940. Searchlights were turned on, stabbing out across the dark waters of the fjord. Their beams swept across the water and then locked onto the massive shape of the Blücher, leading the German formation. The sight was stunning. The heavy cruiser, all 14,000 tons of her, was moving steadily up the channel. Her guns trained to port and starboard, her silhouette unmistakable. Behind her came the Lützow and the other ships. The Norwegians challenged the ships, demanding identification. The German ships did not respond adequately. There was some confusion. Were these German ships or Soviet ships? Reports had mentioned potential Soviet naval movements as well. Colonel Eriksson faced a momentous decision. Norway was neutral. Opening fire on unidentified warships could be an act of war. But unknown warships were forcing their way up the Oslo fjord toward the capital without authorization. His orders were to defend the approaches to Oslo. According to some accounts, he uttered the words, "Either I will be decorated or I will be court-martialed." Fire. At approximately 4:21 on the morning of April 9th, 1940, the old Krupp guns at Oscarsborg Fortress opened fire. The first salvo of two 280mm shells roared out from the fortress, their muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like lightning. The third gun, which had a slightly different position, fired moments later. The range was point blank by naval standards, perhaps 1,600 meters. At such close range, there was no time for elaborate fire control calculations. The Norwegian gunners, many of them elderly reservists who had trained on these guns years ago, aimed visually and fired. The first shell struck the Blücher amidships, penetrating her side armor and exploding inside the ship. The second shell hit near the aircraft hangar, causing massive damage. The third shell also hit, devastating one of the anti-aircraft gun positions. The effect was catastrophic. The shells, each containing over 250 kilograms of high explosive, detonated inside the cruiser. Compartments were ripped apart, men were killed instantly, fires broke out. The ship's aircraft, fueled and stored in the hangar, caught fire, and the aviation fuel added to the conflagration. Aboard the Blücher, the sudden attack caused instant chaos. Men who had been asleep or resting were thrown about. The lights went out in some sections as electrical systems were damaged. Smoke and fire spread rapidly. The damage control parties rushed to respond, but the damage was severe and spreading. Captain Voldag on the bridge realized immediately that his ship was in mortal danger. He ordered increased speed to clear the killing zone, but the ship's engineering spaces, though not directly hit in the first salvo, were affected by the damage and fires spreading through the ship. The Norwegian fortress continued firing. The 150mm secondary batteries joined in, pouring shells into the German ships. The Blücher, designed to fight other surface ships in open water, was helpless against land fortifications at point-blank range. The Lützow, following behind the Blücher, was also hit by shells from Oscarsborg, taking damage to her fire control systems. Her commander, seeing the fate befalling the Blücher, ordered a withdrawal. The other ships of the group, unable to proceed past the fortress, also withdrew southward down the fjord, taking some additional damage from the Norwegian guns. But for the Blücher, it was too late to withdraw. She had absorbed terrible damage, and worse was yet to come. As the Blücher, on fire and damaged, attempted to clear the Narrows, she came within range of the Norwegian torpedo battery at Kopos Point. The battery commander, Lieutenant Commander Andreas Andersen, had been waiting. His two ancient torpedoes were ready, their tubes aimed at the center of the channel where any passing ship would have to go. The Blücher, wreathed in flames and smoke, presented an unmistakable target. At approximately 4:25, just minutes after the gun battle had begun, Andersen gave the order to fire. The two torpedoes, more than 40 years old, launched successfully and ran true. They struck the Blücher on her port side, approximately amidships. The explosions were massive. Each torpedo carried hundreds of kilograms of explosives. They detonated against the ship's hull, blowing huge holes in her side below the waterline. Water poured into the ship in torrents. The torpedo hits caused catastrophic flooding. The Blücher's watertight compartments were designed to handle some flooding, but the damage was overwhelming. Multiple compartments were open to the sea. The weight of the water flooding in caused the ship to list heavily to port. Worse, the torpedo explosions damaged the ship's power systems. The generators, already stressed by the damage from the shell hits, began to fail. Without electrical power, the pumps that might have controlled the flooding stopped working. The damage control parties, fighting in darkness lit only by hand lamps and the light of fires, could not effectively contain the flooding. The Blücher began to slow, her momentum carrying her forward but her speed dropping. The list to port increased as more water poured in. Fires raged above decks and below, fed by ruptured fuel lines and combustible materials. Aboard the stricken ship, officers and men fought desperately to save her. The damage control parties, working in smoke-filled compartments, tried to shore up bulkheads, tried to contain the flooding, tried to isolate damaged sections, but the damage was too severe. The firefighting parties battled the blazes, but with water pressure dropping as the pumps failed and as flooding increased, they lacked the resources to contain the multiple fires burning throughout the ship. In the engine rooms, the engineering crews fought to keep the machinery running, to provide power and propulsion. But the flooding was reaching the engineering spaces. Water sloshed around the machinery. Steam lines were ruptured, releasing superheated steam that could kill a man in seconds. The engine room crews trapped below in the growing inferno showed incredible courage, staying at their posts, trying to keep the ship alive. The medical staff worked frantically in the sick bay and in makeshift aid stations throughout the ship, treating the wounded. Men had been burned, blown apart by explosions, crushed by falling debris, scalded by steam. The doctors and corpsmen did what they could, but they were overwhelmed. The soldiers, packed into compartments below decks, were in a particularly desperate situation. Many of them didn't know the ship's layout. In the darkness and chaos, with smoke filling the passageways, with water rising in some compartments, panic threatened. Officers and NCOS fought to maintain order, to guide their men topside, to prevent a stampede that could doom everyone. On the bridge, Captain Voldag and Admiral Kumitz assessed the situation. Reports came in from throughout the ship: fires out of control, flooding uncontrollable, power failing, list increasing, casualties mounting. The decision that no captain ever wants to make loomed before them. The Blücher, now barely making way, was drifting in the fjord. The current and her slight remaining forward motion carried her closer to the western shore, where the small island of Askholmen lay. By 5 a.m., less than an hour after the first hits, it was clear that the Blücher could not be saved. The list had increased to 20 degrees or more. The ship was settling by the stern. Fires were raging uncontrolled, and the flooding continued unchecked. The decision was made to abandon ship. In any abandonment, especially of a sinking warship, chaos threatens. Over 2,600 men, the ship's crew and the embarked soldiers, had to get off the ship in an orderly fashion. Boats had to be lowered, life rafts had to be deployed, life jackets had to be distributed. The crew, trained for this eventuality, worked to make it happen. The boat crews manned the davits and began lowering the ship's boats. But many boats had been damaged in the attack or were being consumed by the fires. The boats that could be launched were quickly overloaded. Life rafts were thrown over the side. Men jumped into the frigid water, which was cold enough to kill in minutes if they couldn't be rescued quickly. The distance to shore was not great, perhaps 200 to 300 meters, but for men in heavy uniforms, many of them wounded, it was a desperate swim. Some men climbed down lines and cargo nets hanging over the side. Others simply jumped. The water, churned by the sinking ship and filled with men swimming, was a scene of chaos. Oil leaking from the ship's ruptured fuel tank spread across the water, making swimming harder and posing a fire hazard if it ignited. By 6 a.m., the Blücher was clearly doomed. She had drifted to a position near Askholmen Island, listing heavily. The bow was rising as the stern settled. Men were still clambering off the ship, jumping into the water, swimming for shore or for the boats, picking up survivors. Then, around 6:23, the magazines exploded. The Blücher had been carrying hundreds of tons of ammunition. Shells for the main guns, ammunition for the secondary batteries, torpedoes, and depth charges. As the fires spread deeper into the ship, they reached the magazines. The safety systems that were supposed to flood the magazines and prevent just such an occurrence had failed. When the magazines detonated, the explosion was tremendous. It ripped the Blücher apart. The entire midsection of the ship erupted in a massive fireball. Debris was hurled hundreds of meters into the air. The shock wave rocked the small boats and fishing vessels that had come out from shore to pick up survivors. What was left of the Blücher capsized and sank within minutes. She went down in relatively shallow water, perhaps 80 to 90 meters deep, close to the shore of Askholmen. The bow section and parts of the hull remained visible above the surface for a time, marking the grave of the ship. The time from the first hit to the final sinking had been about 2 hours. The pride of the Kriegsmarine, one of Germany's newest and most powerful warships, was gone. The sinking of the Blücher resulted in significant loss of life. Of the approximately 2,600 men aboard, crew and embarked troops, between 600 and 1,000 died. The exact number has never been definitively established, as records were incomplete and many bodies were never recovered. The dead included sailors who were killed by the initial shell and torpedo hits, men who drowned in flooded compartments, men who were trapped below when the ship capsized, men who died in the freezing water before they could be rescued, and men who were killed in the magazine explosion. Among the dead were men from the engine rooms who had stayed at their posts trying to save the ship until the flooding overcame them. There were gunners who had died at their posts. There were young soldiers who had never seen combat before, who drowned in dark compartments below decks. There were officers and senior NCOs who remained aboard to help others escape and who went down with the ship. The survivors were picked up by a combination of the ship's boats, Norwegian fishing vessels, and other small craft. Many suffered from hypothermia after their time in the cold water. Many were wounded, burned, or injured. The Norwegian civilians and military personnel who assisted in the rescue showed humanity and compassion, pulling exhausted, traumatized men from the water, providing first aid and shelter. The survivors were initially gathered on the shores near the sinking site. Later, they were moved to Oslo and to prisoner of war camps. For them, the war would continue, but in a different way. Many would spend years as prisoners. Some would never fully recover from the trauma of that April morning. The sinking of the Blücher and the retreat of the other ships of Warship Group 5 had immediate consequences for the German invasion of Norway. Most critically, Oslo was not seized in the initial assault. The German plan had called for troops to be landed directly at the Oslo piers at dawn, with the city secured by mid-morning. With the Blücher sunk and the other ships driven back, this couldn't happen. This delay proved crucial for the Norwegian government and royal family. King Haakon VII, the government and the parliament were able to evacuate Oslo before German forces arrived. They moved north, first to Hamar, then to other locations, maintaining the legitimate government of Norway in exile on Norwegian soil. The gold reserves of the Bank of Norway were also evacuated from Oslo before the Germans arrived, denying Germany an important financial prize. The delay allowed Norway to mobilize more effectively. While Norwegian resistance would ultimately be overcome, the escape of the government and the continued resistance prolonged the campaign and tied down German forces. However, despite the setback at Oslo, the overall German operation succeeded. Other landing forces captured their objectives. Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Kristiansand, and Stavanger all fell to German forces. Airborne troops seized airfields, including Fornebu Airport near Oslo. By April 10th, despite the lack of a direct sea landing, German forces were entering Oslo from Fornebu and from the south. Denmark, invaded simultaneously, offered minimal resistance and was occupied in a matter of hours. The British and French attempted to intervene in Norway, landing forces in the north and at other points, but the German control of Norwegian airfields gave the Luftwaffe air superiority. The Allied forces, inadequately prepared and supported, were eventually withdrawn in early June 1940, just as France itself was collapsing under the German blitzkrieg. By June 10, 1940, Norway had surrendered. King Haakon and the government went into exile in Britain, from where they would continue the fight. Norway would remain occupied by Germany until May 1945. Military historians have analyzed the loss of the Blücher extensively. Several factors contributed to the disaster. First, the German plan relied heavily on surprise and assumed that Norwegian defenses would be minimal and unprepared. This assumption was incorrect. While Norway's military was small and its mobilization imperfect, key installations like Oscarsborg were manned by determined defenders. Second, the decision to attempt to force the Narrows at Drøbak in darkness with large warships carrying valuable troops was extremely risky. The constricted waters left no room for maneuver. If the defenders chose to fight, the Germans would be at a severe disadvantage. Third, the Germans underestimated the effectiveness of obsolete weapons in a confined space. The 280mm guns at Oscarsborg were 50 years old, but age didn't matter at point-blank range. Similarly, the old torpedoes, which might have been ineffective in open water against a maneuvering target, were deadly against a ship trapped in a narrow channel. Fourth, the Blücher's design, like that of most warships, prioritized offensive capability over damage control and survivability. Heavy cruisers were designed to fight other surface ships in open water, not to operate in confined spaces against shore defenses. The extensive damage from the initial hits combined with the torpedo strikes overwhelmed the ship's ability to survive. Fifth, the crowding of the ship with troops exacerbated the casualty toll. The soldiers, unfamiliar with the ship and unable to effectively participate in damage control, became victims. Their presence also made damage control more difficult as passageways were blocked and crew members had difficulty reaching critical areas. For Norway and for the Norwegian defenders at Oscarsborg, the sinking of the Blücher became a point of pride. Colonel Eriksson was indeed decorated rather than court-martialed. The defense of Oscarsborg, though ultimately futile in preventing the occupation of Norway, demonstrated Norwegian determination to resist aggression. The few hours gained by the sinking of the Blücher had significant consequences, allowing the government to escape and fight on. For Germany and the Kriegsmarine, the loss was a blow to prestige and to operational capability. The Blücher had been in service for barely 6 months. The loss of such a valuable ship, along with the experienced crew and the embarked troops, was a significant setback. The Kriegsmarine would suffer further heavy losses during the Norway campaign, with numerous destroyers and other ships sunk or damaged. These losses would have lasting implications for German naval strength. In the years after the war, the story of the Blücher was told primarily as a naval story. A warship sunk, a battle fought. But it's important to remember the soldiers who died aboard her. These men were members of the German army, the Wehrmacht. They were not sailors but landsmen pressed into service aboard a warship for a specific operation. Many were young conscripts, others were career soldiers. They came from all walks of life, cities and farms, factories and offices. They had families, parents, wives, sweethearts, children. They had hopes and dreams that had nothing to do with war. They were swept up in events far larger than themselves, following orders, serving what they believed was their duty to their country. When the Blücher was hit and began to sink, these soldiers found themselves in a nightmare situation. Trapped below decks in an unfamiliar environment, in darkness, in smoke, with water rising, they faced terror. Many died without ever seeing the surface, drowned in compartments that became their tombs. Their deaths were no less tragic for being part of an invasion force. War creates such tragedies on all sides. The sailors of the Blücher, the Norwegian defenders at Oscarsborg, the British sailors who would later die in Norwegian waters, the Norwegian civilians who suffered under occupation. All were caught in the machinery of a war that would ultimately claim tens of millions of lives. The wreck of the Blücher lies in the Oslo fjord near the island of Askholmen, in about 80 to 90 meters of water. After she sank, her hull came to rest on the bottom, settling into the soft sediment of the fjord floor. For many years, the wreck was largely forgotten except by locals who remembered the battle and the sinking. Parts of the ship remained visible above water for some time, but eventually the visible portions were removed or corroded away. The wreck became an artificial reef colonized by marine life, mussels, barnacles, and other organisms attached to the steel. Fish found shelter in the wreck's nooks and crannies. Nature, indifferent to human conflicts, reclaimed the Blücher. During and after the war, there was some concern about the wreck as a navigation hazard, though the channel was wide enough that ships could pass safely. There was also concern about potential pollution from fuel oil remaining in the wreck, though much of the oil had already leaked out. Over the years, there were various salvage attempts and surveys of the wreck. Salvage of warship wrecks can be motivated by several factors: recovery of valuable metals, removal of navigation hazards, recovery of munitions or other dangerous materials, and historical interest. In the 1950s and 1960s, some salvage work was done on the Blücher, primarily to remove non-ferrous metals, brass, copper, bronze, which were valuable and easier to work with than steel. Salvage divers cut away portions of the wreck that were accessible and valuable. In more recent decades, the wreck has become a site of historical and archaeological interest. The Blücher is a war grave, the final resting place of hundreds of men. International conventions and Norwegian law provide some protection for such sites, though enforcement can be challenging. There have been concerns about illegal salvage, as warship wrecks contain valuable metals and artifacts that can be sold. There have also been recreational dives to the site, though diving on the Blücher requires technical diving skills due to the depth and the wreck's condition. Like many sunken ships, the Blücher poses potential environmental hazards. Warships carried large quantities of fuel oil, and while much leaked out at the time of sinking or in the years immediately afterwards, some may remain in internal tanks. There are also concerns about munitions. The Blücher's magazines exploded during the sinking, but not all ammunition was necessarily detonated. Shells, torpedoes, and other ordnance might remain on the wreck, posing a danger to anyone disturbing them. Heavy metals and other contaminants from the ship's construction and systems could also potentially leach into the water. Though after more than 8 decades, most of such contamination has likely already occurred. Norwegian authorities have periodically assessed the wreck and its condition, balancing historical preservation interests with safety and environmental concerns. The general approach has been to leave the wreck largely undisturbed, marking it as a war grave and limiting access to protect both the site and potential visitors. In the decades since the sinking, there have been various efforts to remember the Blücher and those who died aboard her. Memorials have been erected, ceremonies have been held, and survivors and descendants of the lost have gathered to honor the memory of the dead. In Germany, the loss of the Blücher is remembered as part of the broader story of the Kriegsmarine in World War II. For those who served in the Navy or who lost family members in naval service, the Blücher's fate represents the dangers and sacrifices of naval warfare. In Norway, the sinking of the Blücher is remembered as part of the story of Norwegian resistance to German invasion. The actions of the defenders at Oscarsborg are celebrated as examples of courage and determination. The few hours gained by the sinking of the Blücher, which allowed the Norwegian government to escape, are seen as strategically significant. For the families of those who died, whether German or Norwegian, the memories are personal and poignant. Sons, brothers, husbands, fathers who went to sea one day and never returned. Letters that stopped coming. The official notifications of death, the uncertainty about final moments, the grief that such losses bring. War creates these losses by the millions. Each one is a personal tragedy, a life cut short, potential unfulfilled, love and joy ended. The Blücher's story is one story among countless others, but it is worth telling and remembering. The story of the Blücher illustrates several truths about naval warfare and warfare in general. First, even the most powerful weapon systems are vulnerable. The Blücher was a modern, heavily armed and armored warship, designed to be one of the most formidable cruisers afloat. Yet she was destroyed by obsolete guns and torpedoes operated by a small garrison in a matter of minutes. Superior technology and training matter, but they don't guarantee success. Circumstances, tactics, and sometimes sheer luck play crucial roles. Second, confined waters are deadly for surface ships. Warships are designed for the open sea, where they have room to maneuver, where their speed and range give them advantages. In narrow channels, fjords, or harbors, these advantages disappear. The defender with fixed fortifications and knowledge of the terrain holds the advantage. Third, war is fundamentally about people, not machines. The Blücher was a machine, a complex one to be sure, but still a machine. What gave her life and purpose were the men who sailed her. Their courage, their skill, their discipline, and ultimately their sacrifice are what we remember. Machines can be replaced, people cannot. Fourth, war is unpredictable. The German plan for seizing Oslo was carefully crafted based on the best intelligence available, executed by trained professionals. It seemed sound. Yet a single fortress manned by reservists with ancient weapons disrupted the entire plan. No matter how carefully war is planned, events can surprise. Fifth, even in war, there are moments of humanity. The Norwegian civilians who helped rescue survivors from the Blücher, the Norwegian soldiers who treated captured Germans with dignity. These moments of compassion and mercy shine through the darkness of conflict. They remind us that even in war we remain human. The invasion of Norway and the Blücher's role in it were products of national ambition and strategic calculation. Germany sought to expand its power, to secure resources, to improve its strategic position. These were rational aims from a certain perspective, the cold logic of great power competition. But the costs were immense, not just for Germany but for all involved. Norway lost its independence and suffered years of occupation. Thousands of Norwegians died or suffered. Germany gained temporary advantages but ultimately lost the war and was devastated in the process. The Blücher and her crew were merely early casualties in a conflict that would spread across the world and claim tens of millions of lives. There is a lesson here, though whether we learn it is another question. Ambition, unchecked by morality and wisdom, leads to tragedy. The pursuit of power and dominance, when it overrides concern for human life and human rights, creates suffering on a vast scale. The young men who died aboard the Blücher were not evil. They were not monsters. They were products of their time and their society, following orders, serving what they thought was their duty. But they were part of a system that launched a war of aggression, that invaded neutral countries, that would go on to commit atrocities on an industrial scale. How do we judge them? This is a question without easy answers. We can acknowledge their humanity, honor their courage, and mourn their deaths, while still recognizing that the cause they served was unjust. We can hold both truths simultaneously, that individual soldiers and sailors deserve our compassion, and that the wars they fought in may have been wrong. What can we learn from the story of the Blücher? Perhaps several things. We can learn about the importance of preparedness. The Norwegian defenders at Oscarsborg, though their weapons were obsolete, were prepared to fight. Their vigilance and determination made a difference, even if it couldn't prevent the overall occupation of their country. We can learn about the dangers of overconfidence. The German planners assumed the operation would be easy, that surprise would be total, that resistance would be minimal. These assumptions cost them a valuable ship and hundreds of lives. We can learn about the resilience of the human spirit. The survivors of the Blücher, who endured the terror of the sinking and years of captivity, went on to rebuild their lives after the war. The people of Norway, who suffered years of occupation, maintained their identity and their resistance and emerged free at war's end. We can learn about the costs of war. The Blücher's sinking, dramatic as it was a tiny incident in a war that killed perhaps 70 to 85 million people worldwide. Every one of those deaths had ripples. Families torn apart, potential unfulfilled, grief that lasted generations. War is not an adventure or a game. It is hell, as General Sherman said, and should be avoided if at all possible. We can learn about the importance of memory. The story of the Blücher would be forgotten if not for the efforts of historians, survivors, families, and others who keep the memory alive. Memory serves multiple purposes. It honors the dead, it teaches the living, and it warns the future. When we forget the lessons of history, we risk repeating its mistakes. More than 80 years have passed since that April morning in 1940 when the Blücher sank in the Oslo fjord. The survivors are nearly all gone now. The youngest would be centenarians. The last direct memories of that day are fading. The world has changed enormously since 1940. The nations and ideologies that fought World War II have passed into history. Germany was divided, then reunified, and is now a peaceful democracy. Norway recovered from occupation and became a prosperous, stable nation. The empires that existed in 1940, British, French, Japanese, Soviet, are gone or transformed beyond recognition. Technology has transformed warfare. The heavy cruiser, the type of ship the Blücher represented, is obsolete. Modern navies rely on guided missiles, submarines, aircraft carriers, and electronic warfare. The kind of close-range gun battle that sank the Blücher would be impossible in modern warfare. Ships engage at ranges of hundreds of kilometers, launching missiles that find their targets with sophisticated guidance systems. Yet human nature has not changed. Nations still compete for power and resources. Leaders still make decisions that send young men and women into danger. Wars still break out, though the weapons and methods have changed. The Blücher's story remains relevant not because heavy cruisers still patrol the seas, but because the human experiences it represents. Courage, sacrifice, terror, loss, ambition, tragedy are timeless. There is an old tradition in seafaring cultures of ascribing personality to ships, of speaking of a ship's spirit or soul. It's a romantic notion, perhaps, but one rooted in the deep relationship that crews form with their vessels. What was the Blücher's spirit? She was a proud ship, named after heroes, built to be the best of her kind. She was powerful, graceful, and modern. Her crew took pride in her, worked hard to make her the finest ship in the fleet. She was also unlucky, or perhaps fated. She served for barely 6 months before meeting her end. She never had the chance to prove herself in the kind of combat she was designed for. The open sea battle against enemy warships. Instead, she was destroyed in a narrow fjord, struck down by ancient weapons in a battle that should never have happened. If ships could have regrets, perhaps the Blücher would regret not having more time, more opportunities to fulfill her purpose. But perhaps, too, she would take some satisfaction in knowing that she and her crew fought and died doing their duty as they understood it. The wreck of the Blücher lies quiet now in the dark waters of the Oslo fjord. Fish swim through her compartments, where men once lived and worked and died. The steel slowly corrodes, gradually returning to the earth from which it came. In time, perhaps centuries from now, she will be gone completely, dissolved into rust and sediment. But her story remains. As long as we tell it, as long as we remember, the Blücher endures, not as steel and machinery, but as memory, as lesson, as testament to the courage and tragedy of those who sailed her. Tonight, as we conclude our journey through the life and death of the German cruiser Blücher, let us think for a moment about the individual men who served aboard her. We have spoken of the ship, of the battle, of the strategic situation, and the historical significance. But behind all of that were individual human beings, each with their own story. There was the young sailor from Hamburg, perhaps, who had always loved the sea and joined the Navy to see the world. He wrote letters home to his sweetheart, promising to marry her when he returned. His letters stopped coming one April day, and she mourned him for the rest of her life. There was the experienced petty officer, a career sailor who had served in the Navy since the 1920s. He was proud of his service, proud of his ship, proud of his crew. He stayed at his post in the engine room as the water rose, ensuring that his men escaped before him. He did not escape himself. There was the young soldier conscripted into the army, who had never expected to find himself aboard a warship. He was seasick the whole voyage, miserable and afraid. When the ship was hit, he was trapped in a compartment below decks in darkness as the water rose. His last thoughts were of home, of his parents, of the farm where he had grown up. There was the ship's doctor, a skilled physician who had hoped his service would be in peacetime. He worked desperately in the sick bay as the casualties came in, trying to save lives even as the ship died beneath him. He went down with the Blücher, still tending to his patients. There was the Norwegian gunner at Oscarsborg, a middle-aged reservist who had trained on the old guns years ago and never expected to use them in anger. He followed his orders, did his duty, and then spent the rest of his life wondering about the men he had killed. He knew it had been necessary, but it haunted him nonetheless. There was the Norwegian fisherman who took his boat out to rescue survivors, pulling exhausted, traumatized men from the cold water. Germans who had come to invade his country but who were now just fellow humans in distress. He saved lives that day and never spoke of it as heroism, but simply as what had to be done. There were the families, the mothers and fathers, wives and children, sweethearts and siblings, who received the telegram or the letter informing them that their loved one was gone. Their grief was private, one of millions of private griefs in a war that created such losses on an industrial scale. These are not specific people. We don't know their names or their stories. But people like them were aboard the Blücher. They lived, they served, they feared, they hoped, they suffered, and many of them died. Their stories are lost to us, but they were real. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered even if we can't name them individually. So as we finish this tale tonight, let us hold a moment of silence in our hearts for those unknown men, for the crew of the Blücher and all those caught up in the tragedies of war. The ship is gone. The men are gone. The world they knew is gone. But as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their story, they are not entirely lost. May they rest in peace. We have journeyed together tonight through the story of the German cruiser Blücher, from her conception in the minds of naval architects, through her construction and brief service, to her tragic end in the cold waters of the Oslo fjord. It is a story of metal and machinery, of guns and armor, of naval strategy and tactics. But more fundamentally, it is a human story of courage and fear, duty and sacrifice, ambition and tragedy. The Blücher was built to be a symbol of German naval power, a beautiful and deadly warship that would have made her designers and crew proud. She had such a short life, barely 6 months from commissioning to sinking, that she never fully realized her potential. She never fought the kind of battle she was designed for, never had the chance to prove herself against enemy cruisers or destroyers on the open sea. Instead, she died in a narrow fjord, victim of ancient weapons wielded by determined defenders, her loss marked by the deaths of hundreds of men who had entrusted their lives to her protection. Was her sacrifice meaningful? Did her loss serve a purpose? These are questions without simple answers. The strategic impact of her sinking was limited. Norway was occupied despite her loss, but the few hours gained by her sinking had consequences, allowing the Norwegian government to escape and fight on. Perhaps the meaning we find in her story is not strategic but human. The Blücher's story reminds us of the costs of war, the fragility of even the mightiest creations, the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, and the tragedy of lives cut short. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you will remember the Blücher as she was in her brief moment of glory. A powerful, beautiful ship, cutting through the Baltic Sea, her crew proud and hopeful, her future seeming bright and unlimited. And perhaps you will remember her as she was in her final moments, burning, sinking, surrounded by men fighting for their lives in cold water, her existence reduced to wreckage and memory. Both images are true. Both are part of her story. The story of the Blücher, like all stories of war, is bittersweet. There is pride and courage, but also loss and sorrow. There is the glory of human achievement in building such a magnificent ship, but also the waste of human potential in her destruction. As we close this story tonight, we remember all those who were part of it. The designers and builders who created the Blücher, the crew who sailed her, the soldiers who embarked upon her, the defenders who fought against her, the rescuers who saved lives, and the families who mourned the lost. Their story is our story, part of the vast tapestry of human history. Threads of individual lives woven together into patterns of triumph and tragedy, hope and despair, light and darkness. May we learn from their experiences. May we honor their memories. May we strive to create a world where such tragedies are not repeated. Rest well tonight, and let the story of the Blücher remind you of the preciousness of peace, the value of every human life, and the importance of remembering history so that we might learn from it. The Blücher is gone, but her story remains. And in the telling of that story, we keep alive the memory of all those who were part of it. Good night, and may you dream of calmer seas and peaceful times. End of documentary.